All right, I'm going to do a review on one of these. This is a 2009 Volkswagen TDI sport wagon. I know there's a little bit of hammering and stuff going on behind me because they're doing the roof next door, so sorry about that. And I'm going to talk to you first about the good things about the car that are really amazing. There's some there's two different things. There's really amazing things about this car, but there's also some negatives that would be pretty substantial to some people. However, it depends on you. So we're going to talk about all of those things. And first of all, I'm going to talk about the positive things. There really is not anything out there that handles the way these Volkswagens do. Volkswagen engineering for handling and for performance, I would say, is a 10 out of 10. The only thing that's better than this is basically a supercar. So if you've ever driven one of those, they're pretty awesome to drive. But these are really excellent handling. The performance, braking power, stopping distance there really isn't anything other than possibly BMW or Mercedes that fits in that category. Let's go inside for a second. Running wise, if you're tall, you can fit almost any person, and even there is some headroom, even though it has the what's this called, the panoramic sunroof on this car. Also, we also have a 2006, which is very similar, Jetta, regular, not a sport wagon, but a regular Jetta, also a TDI. And as far as performance, handling, and all that stuff, it really isn't much anything else that fits in this category. Other than, like I said, BMW, Mercedes, and then you're going to be talking a lot more money and a lot more expense, and just as many problems as fixing it as there is maintaining this car. So, and in fact, the parts and stuff are actually quite a bit more expensive for those cars. So, with that, I would say, ownership of the car for the first 100,000 miles is probably pretty good. I got the car myself at 160,000, and it just had some major repairs done to it. So I actually drove it for another 100,000 without any issues or problems. But there are several things that need to be maintained, and they need to be maintained properly. And this car is very finicky. If you do not do things exactly, and I'm going to tell you exactly as they're supposed to be done, and using 100% German parts and things like that, when you do repairs and oil changes, need to be done with specific oil. Volkswagen is very specific on what you put in the car, and if you go and deviate from that, you're probably going to have issues. So a lot of people will say they've had issues with this car, and generally those are the reasons why. There's a lot of things that need to be maintained on it. One of the things that's weird, and I'll tell you one more really good thing is the automatic transmission shifting is second to nothing. There really isn't anything else that shifts when it's working properly, that shifts nearly as good and is prominent and is efficient as this car. It has a DSG transmission. They're actually really good for up to probably 300 to even 500,000 miles without doing much of anything other than maintenance. There is some maintenance to do, and we're going to talk about those things in this video as well. So anyway, the good things are we talked about. The bad things are these things here. The maintenance cost, all the things you have to do to maintain the car is, if you're not a mechanic and you have no mechanical skills and you have to take it to the shop for everything, it's going to probably nickel and dime you to death. And if you're a mechanic, you're probably not going to like working on it. It's very difficult to work on. The engine is very hard to get to. There are some tricks and things like that to working on it. One of the things that a lot of people don't know is there's something called service position or service mode that this car can go into, where you literally take off these two bolts here, those two bolts there, the grill, and then the front bumper cover comes off with a few screws that are behind that. And then there's literally 4 bolts here, 4 bolts there, and some couple of wiring clips, and taking off the hood hood release cable, which don't forget to put that one back on. I've done that a couple times. So literally the front end can come off the car. The only down to that is you have to actually disconnect the air conditioning. Kind of a fail as far as that goes as service. I don't know why they made it that way. Should have been some way to disconnect that without having to take the air conditioning out of the car, you know, the Freon. So there's a couple things that you need to know that need to be done on this car. And number one, you have to use a specific oil. For this car, it's 507 compatible Volkswagen compatible oil. Typically, it comes in a German bottle. I use Pentacin oil for mine. And if you use that oil, you can get, you know, a ton of miles. The bones of this engine and transmission, I'm going to say the bones, the, you know, crankshaft, rods, pistons, all the bones inside, the gears inside the transmission are pretty much bulletproof. They're really, really tough. The bearings last for a long time and things like that. And even the body, the wheel bearings on the body, things like that last a long time. But servicing it, obviously you can see everything's really tight in here. There's a cover that goes over the top of this that I don't have on it right now. But there's a cover that goes over that, and it's actually very not accessible. The turbo is down behind here. Very difficult to get to. A lot of things to take off and to remove it if you have to service that. On this particular model, the CBE engine on this 2009 had an issue. Of course, VW does some amazing engineering on one end, but they have some really, really bad engineering on the others, where they had a balance shaft system in for the oil pump, and they had the oil pump running at twice engine RPMs, which typical cars, almost any other car there is, even Volkswagen, usually runs their oil pump at half engine RPM. So twice RPMs was kind of a bad idea, and there's a hex shaft that goes out in the oil. I've had to actually, you know, mine went bad, and basically you end up wiping out your turbo and possibly the bottom end on the engine on this year only. Now that was the CBE, people call it, as the A is the horsepower. The CJA, which is the next predecessor to this engine, was basically the same engine without the balance shaft and oil system. So that engine, the bare bones of that engine are even better than this one. So if you have a CJA model, the 2015 starts to get into the crazy smog stuff, I think, or 14, somewhere in there. They start getting a lot more stuff on them. A lot more difficult to work on, of course, a lot more expensive to work on. The 2010-11, I believe, still have this same setup that's in this one. I'm not sure if there's much difference. I don't own one, so I can't tell you, but I think they are very similar. So, the good things are it puts out quite a bit of horsepower. It's very clean as far as clean burning. People have the TDI scandal that said that it was 40 times the emission standards, but they've actually made the emission standards so low that 40 times that emission standard, and that's only when you're flooring it, okay? 40 times that emission standard was kind of still really clean. So I don't know why they made such a big fuss about that. It's kind of a government issue, I think, more than it was a Volkswagen problem. Volkswagen just didn't know how to fit into that ridiculously low standard that they put forth on these engines at that point. So they cheated, of course, and ended up in trouble with that. But the real problems with this engine really are this one thing, and it's called the CP4 fuel pump that's in it. This is also a problem with Ford 6.7 injection. Has a CP4 pump. This is a CP4 pump. I don't have a CP4 pump anymore in my car. But The CP4 came also in the Duramax from 2011 to 2017. Duramax actually got smart and they canned Bosch, who's the manufacturer of these, and they got rid of Bosch injection and went to Denso. The Ford, of course, kept it. So I would not buy a Ford either, because you cannot replace it with the other pump. There's not enough room inside there. On the Volkswagen, you can actually replace it with the CP3 pump. It does take a little bit. It's not the proper pump for the car, so it does take a little bit of work to do. But once you've done that, this engine, if you're willing to do the maintenance, can last a long time, and you can get literally, 500,000 miles out of your car if you are willing to do the maintenance, which there is a bit of that. This car is driven with a timing belt. It has a timing belt system, so the timing belt water pump is recommended to be done every 80,000 miles. You could probably push it to 100. It's up to you on that if you were putting a lot of miles on it. I'm going to start pushing mine up to 100,000 before I replace it, because I found that every time I take it off at 80, it looks like brand new still. So yeah, I could, it depends on how you want to do that. The transmission, the issues with that are basically there's three major issues. One is it has a flywheel that needs to be replaced every, I'd say, between 120 to 200,000 miles, somewhere in there. The flywheel will start to get loose. It has a two-piece flywheel that gets loose inside, and has a balancing system in it, and they wear out and they need to be maintained and replaced every so many miles. So it is kind of an expensive repair. It is kind of involved if you're going to do it yourself. But it's called the dual mass flywheel. So it has dual mass inside there that fails and eventually starts to make noise usually, and it'll let you know it starts making a little noise. And then at that point, you're going to schedule to fix it. You have, put a few miles on it before you can do that. It'll make that noise for a little while before it finally does something very bad. If you let it get to that point, it's going to be a bad day. So that goes bad. The other thing that happens is this is basically a stick shift transmission that's in this car with a valve body and a wet clutch system. So the valve body is controlled by the computer, which is actually very complicated. If you're going to work on your own car, you need to have something called either a VAGCOM or a Rostec, and you plug it into your OBD2 system and you learn to fiddle with that. There's a lot of information on the TDI Club about it, so you can figure out how to fix a lot of it yourself. But again, the physical part of it is it's very hard to work on. It takes a lot of time. Those are things that might be a big downer for you. The DSG transmission can last. So sorry about that. The transmission, what I was going to tell you about on this car, actually, there's basically two things that can go wrong, or three things. The flywheel is one of them, is a maintenance item, and then there's the clutches that are another maintenance item. And the other thing that can go wrong is typically, and it usually happens, it's just one of those things that can go bad or not. You might not ever have a problem with, is the valve body. So the valve body can have usually there's two little controllers inside there that go out, N215, N216, and you can solve the problem by actually putting another valve body on. It's an in-car repair. That is actually not that hard to do. The most common things that go out are the clutches, and you get a code. And what will usually happen at first is you'll have the transmission will click when you go to put it from reverse into drive. You start hearing some clicking noises. It goes click, 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 and then it goes into gear. And that's trying to let you know that your clutches are starting to wear. And then you'll get a code at some point. There's about 3 different codes that can happen. And that's why it's good to have that Rostec. There's 3 different codes that can happen. When one of those codes happens, that actually is telling you that your clutches are bad. And it's to make the clutches last a little bit longer. The most important thing to do is when you're stopped at a light, hold your foot firmly on the brake pedal. Don't creep forward. Don't do this, and that'll make your clutches last a lot longer. And those are basic things to do. If and don't use 2 feet. Don't ever put your foot on the gas and on the brake at the same time. That can wear your clutches out very quickly. So if you take care of it and you maintain it, the clutches can last a long time. You're looking at 200,000 miles or more before you have to replace them. And then when you do them, you're probably going to go to 400 or more before you'll have to ever do anything with the bearings or anything in the transmission. They're usually pretty tough, and the gears are really tough too. So the bones of it are really, 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 really strong. Like I said, all the issues things are on the outside of it. So the engine, other than the fuel pump, can last, again, a lot of miles. A couple things that also happen is your intake manifold. You can get a code for your intake manifold. There's an easy, cheap repair. You put a little. It's actually a little piece you bolt onto this part right here that actually makes the code go away, and it's because it's the intake manifold starts to wear. There's a flapper inside of it. It's kind of funky it's all smog stuff. The EGR system can need to be maintained, and also the catalytic converter system can start to plug up. Things that happen every once in a while. The turbo goes bad. It usually is because they're not using the proper oil. If you're using all the specified fluids in it, it usually will last a long time. A couple 300,000 miles or more on a turbo is average. So about 200,000 to 300,000 somewhere in there usually on the turbo without any issues. The cooling system needs to have a special coolant. Again, that's they say G12 if you look here. And this year, and most of us are using the later version, which I think is G13 or whatever. It supersedes the older one. So you need to use the specified coolant in it as well. So you don't just go grab anything from the parts store and use that. And also, your water in the system should always be either distilled or they'll tell you distilled, but I've been using reverse osmosis water, which to me is about similar, and it's all the alkalis and things like that in the water that make your engine, your radiator go bad quicker. So, but for the most part, these cars can really last if you're willing to do the work. Like, for one thing, look how hard it is to reach the alternator on this. You literally have to put it in service mode to get to the alternator. So it's a lot of work to maintain. So a simple thing like that can go out. The starter is actually fairly easy. It's below this box right here, and 2 bolts and a couple of wires, and you can have that out in maybe an hour. But the alternator itself is very difficult to reach. The timing belt's kind of hard to do. It's really a tight area. So it's one of those things that, like I said, if you're willing to do the work, it is and I completely understand if you don't want to, because I've been there. I don't want to work on this car sometimes. I get to the point where it's just like I don't want to work on it. It's very, very hard to work on, and it's the problems with it are not much, okay, but they are really hard to work on. Like the EGR tube gets plugged sometimes, and it goes from here underneath all this garbage and goes back to the back. And there's something called an EGR cooler below that can go bad. It's all emissions equipment. If you live in an area where you can delete that stuff, then it might not be a bad buy for you. And if you can do the extra work, like I said, those are the things that you could consider by owning it. If you do a tune to the engine, Malone and Kerma Diesel also both do tunes to this engine, and the lowest grade tune I think is to 170 or 180 horse. Okay, and I've heard of people that have done that tune, and that actually improves your gas mileage up to probably 47 miles to gallon. So, it's about $600 or $700, $800 to do that if you do it yourself. And some people say that's really worth it to do. I would like to do that to this if I can ever get it fixed. I do have some issues myself right now. My problem with this car has been that I had the CBE engine and my oil pump failed and blew out my turbo. And that was a very expensive repair, as well as my clutches wore out in my transmission around the same time, so I went ahead and did them both. And I was actually going to put a used engine in, and didn't work out that way. It didn't work. It was like, well, that would just solve the problem. I could get another engine, another transmission out of a wrecked car, put it in here, program it to the car, and just keep going. But that didn't work out for me. I just had bad luck. So I'm not saying that I'm not going to make the car the issue. I'm going to say that was pretty much bad luck for me. So, but generally the car itself is actually a pretty good car. If, like I said, if you're willing to do the work. If you don't want to do it, I completely understand. It is not easy to work on. People who've worked on these, even the guys at the dealer, have crying sessions. They have like a room they go to vent, because it's just like so difficult to work on sometimes that they just run into, panic attacks and whatever else. I don't know. That's I was talking to one of the dealers, and they were mentioning that they had something like that there because it's really, really hard to work on. So, not a bad car. It does have some engineering flaws. Like I said, the flywheel on this one had the issue with the balance shaft in the oil pump was a bad engineering idea. The CJA, from what I understand, eliminated a lot of those problems, but you still always will have the problem of the CP4 pump. Bosch, they really dropped the ball on the CP4. If you look at the difference between a CP4 and a CP3 in internals, it is like night and day difference. They just aren't built the same. And the CP3 was the earlier model of Bosch, and then they changed the CP4 later. And the CP4, I think, is an absolute fail, in my opinion. And so if you do buy one of these and you have not changed your fuel pump, just so you know, when it goes out, it pushes metal shavings into the entire fuel system. All the injectors need to be replaced. Metal shavings get stuck on the magnets inside both fuel pumps. This one, the one in the tank. All your filter systems have to be changed. You have to take all the fuel out of your tank, clean out your gas tank really, really, really clean. Clean out all the lines, clean out all the hoses, probably replace some of them. Guys are actually replacing this. You're talking about, if you buy the parts at a discount, you're probably talking about $3,000 to $4,000, $3,500 in parts. If you have it done at the dealer, it's about $9,000 to $10,000 in repair. So replace that pump before it goes bad if you have the car. It really is detrimental to the life of the car, because when this goes out and you weren't ready for it, it's going to be so expensive, you're probably just going to get rid of the car. So you might want to just take care of that before it happens. The other thing you can do as well is, if you were going to keep it CP4, you could replace it every, say, 100,000 miles or a little less, because I've heard of people having 100,000 kilometers in their car and having the CP4 itself wear out. This is the CP4 from this car. I've replaced it with the CP3. So it's actually still good inside, but I wouldn't even sell it to someone because I'm afraid of it being bad or going bad quickly. It's got, it has, about 110,000 miles on it. So, and they're an aluminum bore inside, and the bore actually starts to wear, and then the piston inside it turns sideways, and that's when all the catastrophic stuff starts to happen. So anyway, that's a little bit about the TDI. Is it a buy? It's kind of one of those things where you need to decide that for yourself. If you don't want it, one of these, I completely understand. But if you really like that performance of the driving the car, I find it hard to get rid of it. I really do enjoy driving the car. It drives amazing. I've had Porsches. I've driven a Ferrari. I've driven twin turbo Porsches, and this car to me feels like a lot like a 911 when you're going up the mountain roads. It just sticks to the ground and just corners like nothing else. Nothing else in its category. There's nothing that even compares to it. And I've driven a lot of cars. I've rented a lot of cars, and this one seems to be the one that sticks as far as that goes. But as far as the maintenance, I would say Driving, it's about, I'd say it's near a 10 out of a 10. Maintenance, it's about, to repair, it's about a 1 out of a 10. It's probably the hardest there is. It's probably, any of the supercars are always really hard to work on too. So those, I don't like working on them. But like Porsche, you know, they really jam their stuff in there. And same thing with Ferrari, you know, it's just not easy. Where the engine's located, it's really hard to work on, and there's a lot of maintenance to do on them. But that's what you pay if you want performance. You know, this is a performance car. In my opinion, it's not just a regular car. It's a performance car, and if it's, you know, performance, you're going to have issues. So, you know, either you get performance or you don't get performance. So anyway, if you want a good, solid car, you don't want to have to deal with all this stuff, Toyota and Honda are pretty much number one. I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Please like, share, and subscribe.